She called me a broke, worthless failure in uniform, insisting nobody could possibly get that kind of money unless they'd stolen it. My older sister Vanessa's voice cut through the lobby like a blade. Right there, in front of my terrified boy, she grabbed the $5 million check, tore it clean in half, and flung the pieces down onto my worn-out combat boots. The sharp rip of paper tearing seemed to sever whatever thread of family loyalty had still connected us. "Someone call security. Arrest this thief," she shrieked, practically glowing with triumph as she trampled her own sister's dignity in front of a packed lobby. I watched the confetti of that shattered check drift down and settle on the marble floor, and I tightened my hold on my son's hand. My eyes went flat and cold. I didn't move. I didn't fight back. Because what she had no way of knowing was that her furious phone call to the police had just set off a chain reaction that could end with a classified $750 million government contract wiping this entire bank off the map. Before I get into what happened next, if this story is hitting home for you, drop a like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. As the torn white scraps of that $5 million check floated through the recycled lobby air and landed on my mud-worn boots, the sting of humiliation dragged my memory backward, not forward, backward, into an old wound I'd spent years burying under discipline and silence. I could almost smell the engine grease of an overseas base 10,000 miles from home. I looked down at the frayed edge of my tactical jacket, the very same jacket my ex-husband had once sneered at the night he packed his bags for good. He'd stood in our cramped living room, suitcase zipped, keys jangling in his fist, jabbing a finger at the olive fabric draped over the kitchen chair. He called my service to this country a pathetic excuse for never earning real money. He said our son would grow up embarrassed of a mother who chose mud and gunfire over a paycheck. He said he'd found someone in the city, someone wealthy, who understood what a man actually deserved, unlike me, too stubborn and too broke to give him that life. I'd been at the kitchen sink, washing our son's plastic cereal bowl, when he delivered that verdict on our marriage. I can still feel the warm water on my hands, the soap sliding between my fingers, the exact tone of his voice when he said our boy would be better off without him. He never kissed our son goodbye. He didn't even glance toward the bedroom where the boy slept with his stuffed dinosaur tucked against his cheek. He just slammed the door so hard our wedding photo crashed off the wall, glass scattering across the floor, shards I'd find 3 days later, barefoot, bleeding from cuts I never saw coming. That memory burned in my chest like acid every single day. My family had always measured a soldier's worth in dollar signs, and I never came out ahead in their math. My sister had sided with my husband through the whole divorce, telling our parents I'd pushed him away with my stubbornness, telling anyone who'd listen that I deserved to end up alone. I swallowed that memory down again, grinding my boots into the marble, and pulled myself back to the reason I'd walked into this glass and marble fortress 15 minutes earlier. Just a quarter hour before all of this exploded, my son and I had parked our old, dependable truck in the crowded, luxury car-filled lot outside the Ellsworth branch of Holbrook Bank. The exhaust rattled as I cut the engine, red dust from the unpaved road out of our town coating the hood and the cracked windshield. My son unbuckled and grabbed his backpack, the one with the busted zipper he refused to let me replace because his best friend had doodled a crooked dinosaur on it during recess. He slung it over one shoulder and waited by his door for me to come around, the same little routine we'd kept up since he was old enough to sit up front. Our plan for the day was nothing extraordinary. Deposit government funds at the bank. Walk 3 blocks to the bookstore so he could buy the comics he'd been saving allowance for. Finish up with pulled pork and sweet potato fries at our favorite roadside barbecue spot, the one with the flickering neon pig sign that buzzed every time a semi rolled past. Nothing dramatic. Just an ordinary Tuesday. I'd kept my real identity buried for years. Not one teacher at his school, not a single neighbor on our gravel road, had any idea. They saw a tired single mother in worn clothes, driving an old truck, mowing her own lawn, hanging laundry out back. None of them knew that underneath all that, I held the rank of full colonel in the United States Marine Corps, a senior Department of Defense liaison overseeing hundreds of millions in veteran housing and pension funding across 17 states. I kept that secret on purpose, with iron discipline, because I wanted my son to learn that character and integrity define a person, not a brand name or the badge on a car hood. I wanted him untouched by the same hunger for status that had eaten away at my sister, the same disease that had taken his father from our table. The moment we pushed through those oversized glass doors into the VIP lobby, the temperature seemed to drop like we'd stepped into a freezer. The room reeked of espresso and entitlement. The floor was so polished I could see my scuffed boot soles reflected back at me. 3 young tellers stood behind the counter, laughing and scrolling their phones. The second their eyes landed on my faded cargo pants, my weathered face, my son's plain wrinkled shirt, their friendly smiles vanished instantly. One elbowed the other and whispered behind a manicured hand. The other wrinkled her nose and turned her back. They didn't even bother hiding their contempt. We'd been silently written off as unworthy. I watched, detached, as men in tailored suits and women with designer bags the size of suitcases were greeted with bows and instant personal service. A silver-haired man with a golf bag got handed a fresh cappuccino before he even reached the counter. A woman whose heels clicked like a metronome was personally walked into a private consultation room by a manager who nearly folded in half bowing. Meanwhile, my son and I stood at the entrance like we were invisible. The stench of classism hung thick in the air. Without a word spoken, the staff had drawn an invisible line across that marble floor, deciding that a woman in boots and a boy in a wrinkled shirt didn't deserve basic respect. I'd seen this exact pattern before, in war zones halfway across the world. The powerful ignore the powerless. Those who serve get used. Those who are served forget. I felt my son's grip tighten on my fingers, his instincts sharper than any radar I'd ever operated. He could feel the hostility rolling off the staff like heat off pavement. But instead of pulling back, I refused to retreat. I took a slow breath and squared my shoulders, letting 20 years of Marine discipline settle into my spine, the same posture I'd carried through combat zones on 3 continents. The stamped $5 million government check sat folded in my breast pocket, pressed flat against my chest like a plate of body armor. Holding my son's hand tight, I walked straight toward the counter. My eyes stayed locked forward, my face like stone. I had no idea that with every calm step, I was walking directly into the center of my sister's fragile, poisonous ego, and that our quiet Tuesday was about to blow apart. The cold silence from the staff was so obvious that even an 8-year-old could feel it in his bones. My son stopped walking. He tugged at my jacket sleeve, forcing me to stop and look down. His eyes were wide, brimming with a confusion so raw it could crack concrete. He pressed himself against my leg, trying to disappear from the dismissive stares of the security guards near the counter. In a small, shaking voice, he asked why the well-dressed people in this beautiful building weren't friendly like the cashiers at our local grocery store. He asked if we'd done something wrong. He asked if it was because of his backpack. Something in my chest cracked, a fracture I could feel running from my sternum to my throat. He was getting his first taste of raw prejudice, searching his own conscience for some fault that didn't exist, trying to figure out what was wrong with his shirt or his bag that made grown adults refuse to even look at him. Watching him do that lit a quiet, furious protectiveness in me that no amount of training could fully smother. I dropped to one knee right there on the cold marble, the stone pressing through my cargo pants. I used my own body to block him from the judgmental stares behind me. I put my hands gently on his small shoulders, felt the thin bones under his shirt, brushed the hair off his forehead, and held his gaze. "Be patient, sweetheart," I told him softly, pouring every bit of warmth I had into the words. "Don't judge anyone before you actually know them. We came here to do something, and we're going to finish it." I gave his shoulder one firm squeeze, passing him whatever strength I had left. He needed to understand that real resilience means keeping your own honor intact even when the world treats you with cruelty you didn't earn. He needed to know none of this was his fault. He nodded slowly, straightened his back. He was my son. A soldier's son. I stood, rolled my shoulders back, and steeled myself for whatever came next at that counter. The noise of the lobby, keyboards clicking, the murmur of polite transactions seemed to fade away. The frosted glass door of the branch manager's office swung open with a sharp click that echoed like a gunshot. My sister stepped out. Vanessa was dressed in a flawless tailored suit that probably cost more than my truck. Her hair was styled to perfection, her nails a deep glossy red, her perfume announcing her arrival before she even crossed the room. Her eyes swept the lobby with the practiced authority of someone who'd built her whole identity around controlling that space, and they landed on me. I stood still, searching her face for even a flicker of the sister who used to braid my hair before school. I found nothing. Only cold, calculating disdain as her gaze dragged from my dusty boots up to my faded jacket, over my son's cheap cotton shirt and his dinosaur bag, and back to my face. In an instant she'd run the numbers and decided I was an embarrassing stain on her polished little kingdom. Worth less than the espresso she poured for her VIP clients. I braced myself, shifting into a grounded stance, reading her body language the way I'd read a hostile approach at a checkpoint, chin lifted, shoulders tense, a cruel little smirk forming. She was gearing up for a public execution, eager to flex her power in front of her wealthy clientele. I refused to give her the satisfaction of flinching. I walked 3 deliberate steps to the counter, keeping steady eye contact the whole way. I reached into my jacket and, with slow precision, slid the stamped $5 million government check across the glass. That was my opening move in a war I never wanted, setting the stage for 2 completely different worlds to collide. My sister approached in her clicking heels and stared at the long string of zeros on the check. Her pupils widened, not with professional curiosity, but with raw, ugly envy. The idea that her supposedly failed little sister, who'd thrown her life away in the mud of military service, was somehow holding millions in authorized government funds shattered whatever fragile ego she had left. Unable to process it, her spite took over. She raised her voice deliberately, loud enough to carry across the whole VIP hall, wanting witnesses, wanting an audience for the show she was about to put on. A failure earning pennies like you? How could you possibly have $5 million in your hands, she hissed, lips curling back like a cornered animal. Right there under the chandeliers, she accused me publicly of fraud and embezzlement, using our shared blood and her position to maximize my humiliation in front of every stranger in earshot. Her tellers stopped working. Her security guard stepped closer. She was building the trap herself. I didn't flinch. I didn't let a single muscle betray anything. With the same clinical calm I'd carried through 2 decades of active duty, I reached into my jacket and pulled out my military ID along with a thick stack of stamped Department of Defense authorization papers. I set them down on the glass with a crack loud enough to silence the room like a shot fired in a church. The tellers jumped. The nearest guard stepped back. I looked straight into my sister's frantic, jealous eyes. Set your personal grudge aside and do your job. Call the military treasury hotline, everything can be verified in under 2 minutes. My voice stayed low and controlled, offering her a rational way out of the scene she was building. 2 minutes. That was all it would have taken to stop this entire disaster. I was handing her a lifeline, and she couldn't see it through the haze of her own jealousy. From behind the counter, a young teller stepped forward, breaking the standoff. Her name tag read Maya Lawson. Barely in her mid-20s, close-cropped hair, sharp intelligent eyes that shone with more integrity than everyone else in the building combined. Her own father had served 2 tours overseas before losing part of his leg to a roadside device, and she recognized the colonel's insignia and DoD seals the instant I laid them down. Hands trembling with courage, she offered to take the paperwork to the back and personally make the verification call, wanting to handle it quietly and professionally, the way any competent bank should have from the start. My sister spun toward her instantly, hair whipping around, eyes flashing with fury at having her authority questioned by a junior employee. Without hesitation, she leaned over the counter and threatened to fire Maya on the spot, promised to blacklist her across the entire industry, to make sure she never worked another banking job again, to take her apartment, her insurance, everything her family had scraped together since her father's medical discharge left them struggling. It was a calculated strike meant to crush the only decent person in that room. Maya recoiled, burying her face in her hands, sinking down against the filing cabinets behind the counter, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Having crushed the one spark of decency in the building, my sister turned back to me with a victorious sneer, drunk on her own manufactured authority. She refused to even glance at the authentic seals and watermarks lying right in front of her. Verification was never the goal. Destroying me was the goal, had been from the moment I walked through those doors in clothes she considered beneath her. She flicked my military ID off the counter with one manicured finger, like flicking a dead bug off a plate, contempt dripping from her expression. "You think these worthless scraps of paper fool me?" she scoffed, tossing her hair and planting her fists on her hips. By refusing to accept the truth sitting right in front of her, she sealed her own fate. She chose to escalate into a full public spectacle because her pride couldn't stand her younger sister looking taller than her, not even for 2 minutes, not even with proof in hand. The volume of her accusations acted like a dinner bell for every bystander in the building. The tension spread through the lobby like blood in water. Customers abandoned their transactions and drifted toward us, forming a tight crowd around the counter. Phones came out in unison, lenses pointed our way, flashes firing off in bursts. Our humiliation was being recorded from every angle, ready-made content for platforms hungry for spectacle. Not one person in that crowd stepped forward to ask a question or de-escalate anything. They were there to feed off a show, already composing their captions before it had even finished playing out. The heat of packed bodies, the smell of cologne and hairspray, turned the marble lobby into a suffocating cage trapping my son and me at its center. A man shouldered his way to the front of the crowd. Gerald Whitfield, I didn't know his name then, only learned it later from the police report. A local regular at that branch, notorious for chasing VIP status by flattering management. His suit was expensive but ill-fitting, straining at the buttons, a gold watch he made sure to flash with every gesture. He saw a chance to score points with the manager and took it, barking out a loud, theatrical laugh. Manager Vanessa's right, look at this disgrace. Embarrassing the whole military. Probably using her own kid as a prop for some sob story to scam sympathy money out of this bank. He pointed a fat finger straight at my son as he said it. His words weren't just insults, they were meant to slice into an innocent child's mind, weaponizing an 8-year-old's fear to curry favor with a corrupt manager. Parts of the crowd laughed and nodded along. The cruelty was contagious. My son recoiled in terror, his small hands grabbing fistfuls of my pants, his face pressed hard against my thigh. I felt his tears soak through the fabric. My blood went ice-cold. The protective instinct of a mother and the trained reflexes of a Marine colonel collided inside my chest, but I forced them both down, locked behind a wall of discipline. I wasn't going to give this crowd the show they wanted. I looked my sister dead in the eye, offering her one last chance before I ended her career for good. Vanessa, stop now, before there's no way back. Don't let your bias blind you, I warned, my voice dropping into the low, final register I only used when giving orders before an engagement. It was the hardest thing I'd ever done, harder than any firefight, any midnight patrol, showing restraint towards someone who happened to share my blood, who'd slept in the bed beside mine for 16 years growing up. My warning was met with a smirk of pure malice. Riding the high of her audience, drunk on her own fabricated power, she raised the $5 million check above her head for the whole crowd to see, and with a vicious, theatrical motion, tore it in half. The sound sliced through the lobby. she tore it again and again, turning millions in children's fund money into confetti, letting it drift down onto my boots, onto the marble, onto the dinosaur backpack pressed against my son's chest. "That's where people like you belong," she spat, her voice thick with decades of bitterness and superiority. My son dropped to his knees instinctively, small fingers scrambling to gather the torn scraps, trying to put the check back together as if that could somehow fix everything else falling apart around him. I pulled him back to his feet by the shoulder. I would never let my child kneel in front of her. Not that day, not ever. I looked straight through her, past the suit, the perfume, every mask she built to hide what was underneath. "You just ended your own career with your own two hands, Vanessa," I said. My voice never rose. My hands never shook. The words landed between us with the weight of a closing coffin lid. That's when she snatched up the desk phone, dialed security, and screamed for the police. After her hysterical, entirely fabricated call, my sister jabbed a finger toward me and barked an order at her head of security, Dale Ferris, a hulking man with a shaved head, thick neck, and hands like dinner plates, the kind who clearly enjoyed bullying anyone smaller to justify his paycheck and win approving nods from management. He unhooked his handcuffs with a cruel glint in his eyes and shoved his way through the crowd toward us, scattering bystanders with his shoulders. "Hands behind your back, fraud," he growled, ignoring the ID still sitting in plain view on the counter, ignoring the crying child pressed against my legs entirely. He didn't care about evidence or procedure. He cared about performing for the cameras and pleasing his boss. As he swung the heavy cuffs forward in a wide, careless arc to force compliance, his forearms swept dangerously close to my son's face. The boy flinched hard, yanking his head back just in time, the metal whistling past his ear. Time seemed to stop as the threat to my child registered in my brain like a detonation. Every nerve fired at once. In that instant, the mother and the combat veteran in me fused into a single reaction. Before Dale could finish his swing, I deflected his arm with a precise block, redirecting his momentum safely past my son's head without missing a beat. I pivoted, slipped my hip inside his guard, and locked his arm into a joint manipulation I'd drilled thousands of times on training mats from base to base. No punch needed. One controlled twist at his weakest point and he, nearly 200 pounds and a foot taller than me, dropped to one knee with a pained roar, completely immobilized in under 3 seconds. The crowd gasped as one. The giant had been taken down by a woman half his size in scuffed boots. Instead of grasping the magnitude of what had just happened, that she'd ordered an armed guard to swing metal restraints inches from a child's face, my sister seized the moment to twist the story, screaming to the filming crowd, "You all saw it, she's lost her mind. PTSD, a violent psychopath, an out-of-control killing machine." Her voice cracked with theatrical hysteria, but her eyes stayed cold and calculating, fully aware of the narrative she was fabricating on camera. She was turning my service, my sacrifice, into a weapon against me. Diagnosing me in front of a mob. It was the ugliest kind of betrayal, twisting my training and my trauma into evidence of insanity. With the threat neutralized, I released the guard instantly, kicking the handcuffs across the floor out of reach. "Anyone who touches my son gets an arm broken," I said, my voice carrying enough force to rattle the glass partitions and send deposit slips fluttering off the counter. I stepped back from the guard sprawled on the ground and dropped my arms to my sides, palms open, facing outward, the textbook posture of deliberate surrender, captured on every phone in the room. Proof that I wasn't some wild attacker but a trained officer using the minimum force necessary to protect her child from an armed threat. The remaining guards closed in around us in a tight half-circle, stun batons crackling with live current, forcing me step by step back toward the entrance. Behind the counter, Maya was still weeping, curled against the filing cabinets, helpless. The crowd stayed silent and apathetic, cameras flashing from every direction, feeding off our pain without lifting a finger. Not one voice objected. My son buried his face in my thigh, shoulders shaking, then slowly looked up at me through the wall of hostile strangers, tears cutting tracks down his cheeks. "Mom, you fought for them. Why won't anyone stand up for you?" His voice cracked with a grief that could shatter glass. It wasn't a question, it was an indictment of everyone in that room who'd chosen comfort over courage, spectacle over decency. He was learning the ugliest truth about people at 8 years old, and no amount of training could shield him from that lesson now. I crouched slightly, stroking his hair, using my body to block the camera flashes from his swollen eyes. "It's all right, sweetheart. We don't need protection from cowards," I whispered into his hair, holding my chin up as the countdown to the reckoning began. If a crying child asking why the world abandons the people who protect it breaks your heart, hit that like button now. Drop a comment if you've ever stood alone against a cruel, judging crowd, because what happens next is the payback you're waiting for. The remaining guards tightened their circle, batons carving blue arcs through the air like an electric fence closing in. They herded me backward toward the glass doors, boots squeaking on the marble. I held steady, keeping my son shielded from both the weapons and the phones. The silence from dozens of onlookers was deafening, not one objection, not one voice raised. It was a room full of adults watching a veteran mother and her crying son get pushed out by armed guards, and choosing to film it instead of stopping it. I focused on my breathing, for counts in, for counts out, locking my fury behind a mental wall, silently preparing for the police cars I assumed were already on their way, bracing my son for the sight of his mother in handcuffs in front of a cheering crowd. Then everything shifted. The air itself seemed to change. A large shadow fell across the entrance as the automatic doors slid open with a hiss that cut through the crackle of the batons. Marcus Whitfield, CEO and chairman of Hallbrook Bank, strode in, flanked by 4 lawyers in matching black suits carrying leather folders stamped with the bank's gold emblem. He hadn't come for a routine visit. He'd flown in personally to finalize the classified $750 million Department of Defense pension contract, a deal he'd spent 6 months negotiating in Washington to rescue his company's collapsing stock. He'd expected a warm welcome, champagne, a quiet signing ceremony with the military's top representative at his flagship branch. As he crossed the threshold, his polished smile froze. His sharp eyes, the eyes of a man who'd survived multiple recessions and hostile takeovers, swept across the chaos, the shredded confetti of the check on the floor, his own guards brandishing live weapons at a woman in a military jacket, the crowd filming, the guard groaning on the ground, clutching his wrist. Then his gaze landed on me, his most critical client, the sole authorized signer of a $750 million government deal, cornered against his own glass entrance like a criminal, a crying child clutched at her legs. The horror of what his staff had done short-circuited him. His fingers went slack. His leather briefcase, containing the signed contract of a lifetime, slipped and hit the marble with a crack that echoed through the frozen lobby like a gunshot. Every head turned, every camera swung his way. His chest heaved with fury as the scale of the disaster hit him. His bank had just physically assaulted, publicly humiliated, and tried to arrest the very party holding their financial survival in its hands. His voice exploded across the ceiling, rattling the chandeliers, freezing every guard, teller, bystander, and my sister in place. "Colonel Reyes, what in God's name is happening in my branch?" The desperation and respect packed into that single question hit the crowd like a shockwave, shattering the illusion my sister had spent the last 20 minutes constructing. The truth had finally arrived, announced at full volume by the CEO screaming my rank. The entire power balance of the room flipped instantly. Dale dropped his baton like it had caught fire and scrambled backward, realizing he'd just assaulted a federal officer and swung cuffs near a child's face. My sister started hyperventilating, rushing toward the CEO with a manic, fake smile, babbling lies about intercepting a violent fraudster, clearly expecting praise for her vigilance. Marcus didn't even look at her. He walked straight past her outstretched hand as if she weren't there, marching to where I stood shielding my son. He stopped in front of my boots, straightened, and bowed his head in genuine respect, apologizing profusely for the disgraceful conduct of his staff, his voice shaking with fury, shame, and the sound of a man watching his empire crumble because of one manager's arrogance. Then he turned on his heel and aimed a scorching glare at my sister, veins bulging in his neck, pointing down at the shredded remains of the check scattered across the floor. His voice thundered loud enough to rattle the counters. "The woman you humiliated, whose check you tore up, whose arrest you demanded, is Colonel Danielle Reyes, Senior Representative of the Department of Defense. She holds sole authority over the $750 million pension contract that is the only thing keeping this bank alive. And that check you destroyed was legitimate, verified government funding, confirmed by official channels this morning. You didn't just destroy federal property. You slandered a decorated military officer." The revelation hit the crowd like a physical blow. The phones that had been recording a crazy beggar being rightfully thrown out were now capturing a decorated colonel being abused by a corrupt system run by her own sister. The story flipped so violently the whole room seemed to reel. Faces drained of color, phones lowered, jaws dropped. The man who'd mocked my son slipped quietly to the back of the crowd, trying to disappear. My sister's face went ashen, all the blood draining out as she stood frozen in her designer suit like a hollow shell. The crowd lowered their phones one by one, backing away in shame, suddenly confronted with their own complicity in what they'd just gleefully filmed. My sister's carefully built mask of superiority, decades of practiced cruelty and status chasing, shattered completely. Her knees buckled and she collapsed to the floor, crawling toward me on shaking hands, grabbing at the hem of my pants, the very uniform she'd mocked minutes earlier. It was a pitiful sight beyond words. The woman who had sneered at my clothes, shredded my check, threatened an innocent employee, ordered a guard to swing cuffs at my son, and called the police to have me arrested was now sobbing on the marble floor, begging for mercy. She used the word sister, a word she'd spent her whole adult life denying and weaponizing. I looked down at her crumpled form clinging to my boots and felt nothing at all. No anger, no pity, no satisfaction, just a cold, clinical emptiness, the kind that settles in after a long fight when the adrenaline drains away and only consequences remain. My voice dropped to nothing, cutting through her sobbing like a scalpel. The military taught me to risk my life for this country. It never taught me to tolerate cruelty and discrimination, not even from my own blood. I pulled my leg free, breaking her grip for good, the fabric tearing slightly where her nails had dug in. I didn't look back down at her. I looked up at the CEO and delivered my final demand. I want Vanessa Reyes and Dale Ferris terminated immediately. Take their badges and hand them to the police. No quiet resignations, no private settlements behind closed doors. I was ending this publicly, permanently, under the eyes of every camera in that lobby, surrounded by the scraps of the check still scattered at my feet. Within minutes, police sirens filled the parking lot, red and blue light bouncing off the glass facade. Officers arrived expecting to subdue a dangerous suspect. Instead, once they saw my rank on the counter, heard the CEO's furious testimony, and reviewed the camera footage showing Dale swinging cuffs near a child's face, they lowered their weapons and offered sharp, respectful salutes. My sister, stripped of her badge and every ounce of manufactured authority, was walked out in handcuffs, screaming as officers read her the charges, filing a false police report, attempted extortion, destruction of government property, assault by proxy. Dale was shoved into a second cruiser right behind her, his brief reign of intimidation ending with a click of steel around his wrists. By evening, the bystander footage had spread across every platform online, but the story had completely flipped. Clips of a branch manager tearing up a check, ordering armed guards after a veteran mother and her sobbing son, then gaslighting the room by screaming about PTSD went massively viral. News networks led with it. Panels dissected it for hours. Hallbrook Bank's stock cratered as the public launched a full-scale boycott over the institution's culture of cruelty and discrimination. The company was suddenly facing the worst crisis in its history, one no amount of money or crisis management could smooth over. The very apathy my sister had counted on to validate her cruelty became the fuel burning her career to the ground. That night, while news vans camped outside my modest house at the edge of town, I sat alone in the dim kitchen. My son was finally asleep, backpack still clutched to his chest, face puffy from hours of crying. The only sound was the old clock over the stove, each tick falling like a stone into still water. I stared at my faded uniform hanging over the same chair my ex-husband had stood beside when he ended our marriage. A photo of Vanessa and me as kids sat on the shelf above the sink. I took it down and set it face first on the counter without looking at it again. I felt no joy in her downfall, no triumph. Just a heavy, permanent silence. I had severed that toxic bond for good. The sister who once braided my hair, who shared my room for 16 years, who was supposed to be a constant in a harsh world, gone, hauled away on live television while the country watched. Even earning every charge against her, watching a family member dragged out in restraints leaves a scar that no praise or recognition can fully heal. Sitting alone in the dark, my son's shattered question kept echoing in my skull. You fought to protect them, why won't they protect you? The brutal truth hit me like a wave. Without that $750 million contract as a shield, I'd have been sitting in a holding cell that very night, booked and forgotten, while my sister celebrated with champagne, and my son sat in a foster intake room wondering where I'd gone. A veteran without that kind of leverage would have been dragged out in chains while the crowd filmed and cheered. The whole system was broken at its roots. Firing one bad manager felt good, but it wasn't nearly enough to fix the disease running through the institution. My fight wasn't over. It was only beginning. I had to use what leverage I had to tear the corrupt structure down and rebuild it, so no veteran or military child would ever face this kind of institutional cruelty again. 3 days after the incident, Marcus Whitfield and several terrified board members showed up at my front door in a line of black sedans that looked absurdly out of place on my gravel driveway. They crowded nervously around my scratched-up kitchen table, sweating in their designer suits under my wobbling ceiling fan. I served them coffee from a store-brand can in chipped mugs. Desperate to stop the media firestorm bleeding their company dry, they slid thick envelopes across the table, blank check settlements with enough zeros to buy an island. They begged me to quietly sign the pension deal, issue a forgiving statement, and call off the boycott crushing their stock. They believed, like my sister had, that everyone has a price, that enough money could buy silence from a decorated colonel. I looked at the numbers on that hush money check and pushed it right back across the table without hesitation. One envelope slid off the edge onto the cracked floor. Nobody bothered picking it up. I don't sell my silence, I told them, watching panic spread across their polished faces. Firing one manager doesn't fix the apathy of an entire system you've all been enabling. I made it clear that my integrity, built through 3 combat deployments, 18 years of service, and more losses than I could count without my voice cracking, wasn't for sale. Not that day, not ever. My anger wasn't only about Vanessa. It was about the entire corporate culture that let a predator like her thrive unchecked while everyone in power looked away and cashed their bonuses. I pulled a folder from beside my mug and set my own typed list of demands on the table with a crack loud enough to make 2 board members flinch. I laid it out the way I'd give field orders, punctuated by the ticking clock above the stove. Free comprehensive banking for every veteran and military family, at every branch, within 30 days. An independent discrimination hotline staffed by outside auditors answering to no one inside the company. A full purge of every associate my sister had promoted or protected during her corrupt run as manager. A full promotion and management scholarship for Maya Lawson, the only person in that lobby with the courage to stand up for the truth. And finally, a permanent scholarship fund named after my son, funding education for children of fallen service members, endowed by the bank's annual profits in perpetuity. Cornered, hemorrhaging money, facing the largest boycott in the industry's history, and desperate to survive, the board signed every demand without argument. Marcus's hand shook as he initialed the last page and slid it back across my kitchen table. 3 months later, the media circus had finally died down. The news vans left my street. The reporters moved on. My driveway went quiet again. And once more, I walked my son through the front doors of that same branch, hand in hand. I wore the same faded jacket, the same boots, the same cargo pants. His backpack still hung off one shoulder, zipper still broken. Nothing about us had changed, but the bank had been completely, irreversibly transformed. Brass plaques honoring veterans of every branch now hung on the marble walls that once radiated nothing but cold contempt. A framed copy of the veteran service policy I'd forced into existence at my kitchen table sat displayed behind the counter in a polished walnut case. Standing behind that counter, in a tailored charcoal suit, name badge gleaming, was Maya Lawson, now assistant branch manager. She saw us walk in and her hand flew to her mouth, tears running freely down her face, radiating gratitude deep enough to melt steel. I squeezed my son's hand as we crossed the same marble floor once littered with shredded paper. He looked up at me, and this time he didn't ask why people were smiling. He didn't ask why the guard at the door nodded respectfully. He didn't need to ask. He already understood. I'd finally taught him the one lesson no classroom or sermon could. Real power isn't about crushing your enemies out of spite. Real power exists to shield the innocent and to force a cold, indifferent world to change, one institution at a time, one demand at a time, one act of stubborn, unyielding courage at a time. If you believe real power is about protecting the vulnerable rather than chasing revenge, hit that like button, subscribe, and drop a comment about a time you stood up against a broken system yourself.